So there are two things here that we need to do, and this is kind of the general structure of the challenge. We've got to preserve the element of surprise. So the two sides of the identification, x is identical to y, they have to be pinned down with different properties. But we have to do that in a way that doesn't threaten the identity. So they can't be radically different kinds of properties. So we might have an identity claim here that the Terminator is identical to the 38th governor of California. That's surprising. You might say, what? The Terminator was the governor of California, right? It's surprising. Didn't realize this before. Maybe you didn't follow politics way back when, but you were into movies of a certain genre, and you're genuinely surprised by this. But it doesn't threaten the identity, the surprise there, because we're picking out this individual by the same kinds of properties. Okay, look, it's there, he has the same face, etc. Physical properties for a start. So it's not threatening identity. Now, when it comes to mind-brain identity claims, well, the two sides of the identification are definitely pinned down with different properties, right? Brain states, you look inside a brain and you see things maybe with certain equipment, you can see electrical processes, etc. And then your actual experience of seeing an apple. Oh, red, nice, okay. Radically different properties. So that's okay. But it seems like the mental state here, the experience of seeing red, might be something over and above the physical property. It seems like we are kind of left there maybe with an irreducible psychical property. You know, I used the example before of tasting chocolate. I'm tasting chocolate. Oh, wow, man, you got to taste this. So you open up my brain and you start licking my brain, right? In the place that's correlated with chocolate experience. And you go like, man, that's disgusting. I don't like that. No, you're not. There's something over and above. You might say, I've written out a complete description here of everything that's going on in that region of your brain right now. And if the identity claim were correct, then that just is the taste of chocolate, right? And I'd say, no, it's not. I'm having an experience right now, and whatever it is, it seems like it's something over and above what you've got access to when you open up my head and look at my brain, and you can start licking it, okay? So that's the claim here. And because we've got radically different types of properties, then, of course, the identity is threatened. So that's the worry. So the idea here is, well, look, you might appeal to, well, look, fine, I'll just say some kind of brain property is identical to brain activity X. Okay, well, the identity is not threatened there. In fact, it's just an obvious kind of claim now, right? It seems obviously true. But of course, now we don't preserve the element of surprise. It's kind of boring. It's not surprising. Brain process is a brain process. Fine, okay. Nothing surprising. So the identification, the two sides are not pinned down by different properties. Now, the move that Smart makes here is to talk about a topic-neutral analysis. So he says something like, there's something, so it's just kind of, it's topic neutral. Let's not talk about something that might be an irreducible psychical something or something obvious like a brain state. Something. There's something going on which is like what's typically going on when I see, awake, and in good lighting, a red apple. Okay? Now the idea here is that, well, that's going to be surprising enough, he's hoping, for our purposes here. It's going to seem like a genuine empirical discovery or something, or an empirical hypothesis here. And it's going to be an unproblematic identity statement, again, hopefully because of the topic-neutral aspect of it. So it's not going to threaten identity by pinning down each side of the identity claim in terms of radically different kinds of properties. Because one is just like a something, okay? So that's the move here. That's what he's trying to do. One worry here is something that Kim raises. He's like, well, look, hang on, like, is that really what we mean when we just report seeing a red apple, having a red experience? As he puts it, to know that we're having a given experience, do we need to know what generally goes on when we have this type of experience? That's one worry that Kim raises. A bigger challenge here is this guy, Kripke. Saul Kripke, one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century. So he has this claim. He says, genuine numerical strict identity claims, if they're true, they're necessarily true. So he's got this modal argument. A modal argument in philosophy or in logic is an argument that is stated in terms of possibility and necessity. Now, when we say that Superman is identical to Clark Kent, we're kind of saying something like Superman is identical to Superman, right? There's no contingency there. If Superman is identical to Clark Kent, that's necessarily true. Okay? It couldn't be false if it's true. Now, we can say more about what it means to be necessarily true. But the problem here is supposed to be that mind-brain identity statements don't seem like this. They don't seem necessarily true. And if they're not necessarily true, because an identity claim has to be necessarily true if it's true at all, and because mind-brain identity statements seem like they're not necessarily true, then they're not true at all. It's actually worse. They're necessarily false, right? Well, that's a bummer. I mean, Smart is trying to be smart, and he's coming up with this theory, and then Kripke comes along and says, man, your view is necessarily false. It's the worst verdict anybody could ever give you on your philosophical argument, right? I send back your term paper and I say, your conclusion is necessarily false. And you start crying, right? And so you can imagine that Smart is going to be crying at this, right? This is really bad. This is the worst kind of verdict you could have about my argument, okay? Back off, man. That's really, you're being mean. Okay, so there's lots of technical terms here. Two types of designators. Kripke has this view, he invented this view about rigid designators. A rigid designator is something that, a term or a concept that refers to the same individual in every possible world in which they refer at all. We won't worry too much about possible worlds here. They're just logically possible ways that things could be. Okay? So a proper name, like my name, Oisin Deary, refers to the same individual in every state of affairs where it refers at all. Similarly for any other name, obviously. Natural kind terms are the same: water, heat, even H2O. Water refers to the same stuff, namely H2O, anywhere where the term refers at all. Where refer here means just picks out the thing. So when we say, that stuff is water, right? I'm referring to the stuff that's in the puddle over here, let's say, and I'm using the term or the concept water to pick out that stuff in the puddle to refer to it. Okay. Somebody uses the name, say, Oisin is the worst lecturer in the philosophy department, and so they're referring to me when they make that false claim. So a non-rigid designator is a term that's not like that. It's something that refers to different individuals in different situations. So here's a definite description. The person giving this lecture today. That term doesn't necessarily refer to me, because it could easily have been somebody else who was giving the lecture today. Okay? So a non-rigid designator is something like a definite description, like the person giving the lecture today. That might refer to different individuals in different contexts, but my name always refers to me and only me.
So jump back to the previous one, the rigid designators.
Yeah.
In those. Wouldn't that mean that you're saying that you are the worst lecturer in the philosophy here because it's a relative rather than a relational rather than a qualitative property from before?
Oh yeah, I'm not talking about the thing that is being said of me. The rigid designation only happens between the name and the individual.
Okay, so it has nothing to do with properties themselves.
No, that's right. That's right. Okay. Now, these correspond to two different kinds of identity statements. So identity statements that only involve rigid designators are necessarily true, like Superman is identical to Clark Kent. Identity statements that involve non-rigid designators, like the person giving the lecture today. It's kind of like a variable, right? They are not, they're contingent, and so they're not genuine identity statements in the sense of strict numerical identity. Because the person giving the lecture today, that phrase could refer to me, or it could refer to somebody else if I was sick and I asked somebody to come in and take my place. Okay. So the worry here, the argument, which I'll get to in a second, take scientific identity statements like water is H2O. Now, you might think that this is a case of surprising identity. There's something kind of weird. It seems like that's surprising, and so it might seem like it's contingent. So Kripke says we should explain away that apparent contingency. When it comes to heat, we might think, well, what really seems possible is that molecular motion, say, might have existed without being felt as heat. But it's necessarily true that heat is molecular kinetic energy, say, or movement, or something like that. Now, when we take a claim like the identity theorist is making, like pain is identical to C-fiber activation, can we explain away the contingency here? Can we say that C-fiber activation is identical to pain, but like molecular motion might not have been felt as heat, that might not have been felt as pain? And he thinks that's absurd. That pain, because it's so direct and immediate, just is felt pain. That's what pain is. And so it's picked out more essentially by the mental state, the actual experience, than anything else. Now, I'm kind of just going to skip over this quote from Kripke because it didn't work very well in explaining the thing yesterday. And so this morning over coffee, I just made up this less interesting looking slide very quickly, but I hope it will actually explain things better. So this will be posted later on. You can look at the quote here. But here's what I want to do instead. Take two claims. Call one of them S1 and one of them S2. The first one is water is identical to H2O. The second one is pain is identical to C-fibers firing. So here's Kripke's argument. Now, it's not all the premises are not stated. It's not all put here, but I've just tried to keep it as simple as possible, as pared down as possible. His claim, identity statements are necessarily true if they're true at all. If Superman is identical to Clark Kent, then that's necessarily true. It's true in every possible world, in other words, in which the term refers at all, for any of you who are interested in what necessarily true means. Now, it might appear as though statements like S1 and S2 are possibly false. You might say, well, hang on, like, is water made out of H2O? You might want confirmation of that. It might seem like, well, it could be false, right? Now, if a statement appears like it's possibly false, there's only two possibilities here. One is it's either genuinely possibly false, or two, it only appears possibly false. Right? Let's say these two statements, S1 and S2, it looks like they might be possibly false. So we've got to see, well, is it genuinely possibly false or only appears that way? Now for Kripke, S1, the claim that water is identical to H2O, is not genuinely possibly false. It only appears possibly false, and we can explain why. How do we explain why? We explain why by saying, well, the way we pick out water is by the qualitative properties, like it's a clear, odorless liquid that runs from our taps, falls from the rain as sky, flows in our rivers, etc. Now, if we say that that clear, odorless liquid, etc., that a clear, odorless liquid might have been not H2O, well, that seems like it could be true, right? But once we discover that the thing that we call water and that we pick out by those properties is in fact H2O, then the term water picks out and refers to H2O and only H2O anytime it's ever used. We might fly to another planet and go like, oh lovely, a big lake of water, but it's not H2O. We think it's water because it's clear, odorless liquid, but we do some chemical analysis and we find it's made out of XYZ or something else. Okay, so it only appears like it's possibly false, but actually it's necessarily true if it's true at all, and it is true. Now S2, pain is identical to C-fibers firing. He thinks that's genuinely possibly false. Okay? And the strategy for explaining how it might only appear possibly false isn't available. Why? Well, we said that, well, we might identify the way we pick out what water is by the properties, clear, odorless liquid, etc. How do we pick out what pain is? What mental state pain is? We know what pain is. Somebody sticks a pin in you and you go, ow, right? That's pain. Yeah, that's it. You got it, okay? And Kripke's idea here is that that property is not something that we could make a mistake about in the same way that we could make a mistake about clear, odorless liquid. When you feel pain, it is pain. That's all there is to it. It's not like you could have pain that doesn't feel like pain. You could have a clear, odorless liquid that ends up not being H2O, but you could not have a pain that doesn't feel like a pain. So he thinks because S2 is genuinely possibly false, then it can't be a true identity claim, because an identity claim, if it's true at all, is necessarily true. Because it's possibly false, it can't be necessarily true. And so, when you get into the whole modal logic of it, it ends up coming out as necessarily false. So much for the identity theory. Next week, what we'll do is we'll move on to functionalism, and we'll see what historically has been a bigger problem for the identity theory, which is this type-type claim ends up kind of devolving into a mere token-token claim. More on that next week.